I'm honored on behalf of Aperture to present tonight's panel discussion, Contemporary Documentary Practices, in collaboration with the photography program at the School of Art, Media, and Technology at Parsons, the New School for Design, the Vera List Center for Art and Politics, as part of the ongoing Confounding Expectations Photography and Context series. Generously supported by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the Henry Nias Foundation, the ASMP Fund, the Milton and Sally Avery Arts Foundation. For those of you that don't know, Aperture is a world-renowned publisher and exhibition space located in Chelsea, dedicated to promoting fine art photography in all its forms. We are a nonprofit foundation, and our programs include artist lectures and panel discussions like these, limited edition photographs, and traveling exhibitions. On view now through September 13th is Paul Strand in Mexico at Aperture Gallery and Bookstore in Chelsea. Please do visit aperture.org to sign up for our newsletter to find out about more upcoming events and exhibitions. You can sign up outside. We're also offering discounted student subscriptions this evening on your way out if you are interested. Next week at Aperture, we're having a talk with Fred Richin and Brian Palmer on Tuesday, and our next panel with the New School is on December 8th, and that's titled Images, Surveillance, and Power, featuring Trevor Paglin and Jill Majid. Many thanks to all of the panelists joining us this evening for their dedication to education and engagement in the photographic community. A special thanks to the New School, and especially Arthur O, who will be introducing all the panelists this evening. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Arthur O, the BFA director at Parsons, the New School for Design. It's my great pleasure to introduce the panelists for tonight's event. I'm going to keep these introductions fairly short to leave ample time for our distinguished guests. The moderator for tonight is Susan Bright. Susan is a curator and writer currently pursuing a PhD at Goldsmiths in London. She was formerly assistant curator of photographs at the National Portrait Gallery in London, and acting director for the MA program for photography at the Sotheby's Institute in London. Her numerous curated exhibitions include How We Are, Photographing Britain, co-curated with Val Williams at the Tate Britain, and Something Out of Nothing at Photo Galleriat in Oslo. She is the author of Art Photography Now, published by Thames and Hudson and Aperture, and Autofocus, the self-portrait in contemporary photography, just published by Monticelli Press. The panelists tonight are Latoya Ruby Fraser, Chris Vereen, and Michael Wolff. Artist Latoya Ruby Fraser has a BFA in Applied Media Arts at Edinburgh University in Pennsylvania in 2004, and MFA in Art Photography from Syracuse University in 2007. She has exhibited extensively in New York at PS1 MoMA, New Museum of Contemporary Art, Bronx Museum of Art, and a recent solo exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. Her work has been written about in the New York Times, Art Forum, Art in America, the Huffington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Village Voice. She is currently the associate curator for the Mason Gross Galleries in the Department for Visual Arts, where she also teaches photography in the Mason Gross School of Arts at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Artist Chris Vereen holds a BA from Emory University and an MFA from the Georgia State University. His work has been published in several books, including his 2000 self-titled monograph by Twin Palms Press, and a new Phaidon photography history entitled Theater of the Face, Portrait Photography Since 1900. His work has also been exhibited at the Tate Modern and SF MoMA. His work is currently being exhibited in solo museum and gallery exhibitions throughout the United States, accompanied by the recent published book, Family. Artist Michael Wolff's photographs have been exhibited extensively in Asia, Europe, and the United States, and are included in the permanent collections at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the Folkwang Museum in Essen, Germany. His work has been exhibited internationally at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, Aperture Gallery in New York, and the 2008 Shanghai Biennial. Wolf's monographs include The Transparent City, published in 2008 by Aperture, and Museum of Contemporary Photography. Front Door, Back Door, published in 2005 by Thames and Hudson. Sitting in China, published in 2002 by Steidl. And Hong Kong Inside Outside, published in 2009 by Pepperoni Books. The format of the panel this evening is as follows. Susan Bright will introduce the panel, followed by short presentations by each of the three panelists, after which there will be a 30-minute moderated discussion between the panelists. Then we'll open up the panel to questions from the audience. So please help me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Hello, good evening. The starting point for tonight is Martha Rosler's text in around Afterthoughts on documentary photography. This essay is still a go-to text for all teachers of photography, all students, and all photographers who are interested in dealing with documentary practices. It's interesting because it was written in 1981, which was a long time ago. And one of our panelists today wasn't even born. So it intrigued me that it's still such an important touchstone. It's had many lives and resonates for different generations. It first appeared in 3 works published by the press of the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. For my generation interested in photography, I encountered it first in Richard Bolton's collection of essays, The Contest of Meaning. For my students up to about 4 years ago, Liz Wells and her photography reader was their point of interaction with it. And I guess for this generation, it's Google Books. It's around and it's there. So it was, I had to admit, I haven't read it for a couple of years. I haven't taught from it for a couple of years. So I was looking forward to rereading it. And when I got my copy out, it was very well thumbed, it was scribbled on, bits were highlighted, and in the corner it said, read out, very important bits. But it also really annoyed me, which I'd never done before, and that was interesting. But we'll come to that. I think it's still so popular because it's quite an easy read, it's well written, it's very clear. It talks of famous photographers and famous photographs, and it appeals to our kind of liberal left-wing politics and validates our position. But firstly, just to recap on a very basic history of documentary. The term documentary was first coined by the Scottish filmmaker John Grierson in 1926. This, of course, doesn't mean that it didn't exist before this time, and 19th century examples which are often cited are photographers such as Thomas Sanass, pictures of the Glasgow slums, John Thompson in London, and Jacob Riis done here in New York City in the latter half of the 19th century. Documentary movements of the 1930s, such as mass observation in Britain and the FSA here, have done much to establish our thinking about what traditional documentary photography is, and it's this that Martha Rosler concentrates a lot of her essay on. She also looks at the tentative steps of documentary into the art market, which of course is radically different than it was 30 years ago. During the 1970s and 1980s, of which this essay is a product of, there was much debate around the politics of representation, looking, the gaze, the subject and the object, and that's very much at the heart of this essay. Terms of such as truth and neutrality were interrogated, and also positions of power between the photographer and the sitter, or the subject. Strategies emerged in the 1970s and 80s that became much more self-reflexive, or took a more kind of curatorial view to documentary photography, and Susan Masilis is a great example of this. When I was reading the essay, I thought, God, what's interesting to consider here, this is a bit of an aside, but an interesting one, I think, is that everyone now has to do more than just take a picture, which is what Martha Rosler was kind of encouraging photographers, documentary photographers to do. Even the most traditional photojournalists can't just take a picture now. They have to do multimedia, where there's interviews and there's music and there's talk and there's film. So their motivations might be very different from wanting to expand the idea of documentary. It might be more of a survival tactic, but it's interesting to consider in light of this essay. So very broadly speaking, Rosler discusses power relations and how that characterizes documentary photography. And she claims pictures of the poor are framed by a liberal rhetoric and it's part of the genre rather than part of politics. That is kind of a given now, I think, and it's become even more evident now that the art market is so much more established. If we think of documentary artists such as Luke Delahaye, Simon Norfolk, Roger Ballum, they're certainly very interesting. It's politics might have driven them to create their work, but it's aesthetics and form and market price which have come to define them. Thinking about the market and documentary made me realize quite how much has changed with this essay. And first and most obviously is references to the Bowery, which is no longer an archetypal Skid Row. It's a gentrified area of galleries, hairdressers, and Whole Foods. It's not quite so attractive to documentarians anymore. It certainly has its fair share of drunkenness and substance abuse. It's just a very different set of people who are drunk and abused, but they're certainly there. And the 1980s pugnacious self-interest, which she talks about, has become the norm, and even a badge of pride in something that this blogosphere culture aspires to, rightly or wrongly, but that's kind of where we are. It also struck me when I was reading this essay how much smaller the world's got. This essay is fundamentally an essay about American photography, American politics, and history. To write an essay about documentary photography now, you couldn't even start without talking about the web, issues of citizen journalism, modes of display, and taking a much more international approach to it. So although it is a totally relevant essay, and one which I would still reach to, one that I would still encourage students to look at. The thing that annoyed me about it was not actually specific to this essay, but writing about photography in general. And I'm just getting a bit fed up with it. And that is that so much critical writing from the beginning of writing about photography concentrates on its limitations and its failure to meet very high expectations. On one hand, people seem to moan that it's not art, and then when it is art, they're not happy with that either. And there seems to be very little writing that is joyous about the actual medium, and you don't get that in painting or theatre or dance, or even literary criticism, which actually seems to relish the tangible qualities of the medium. And that, to me, is a very curious thing. It's also not just, this disdain for the medium is not actually just the writing about photography. I hear it again and again with artisan photography who just use photography as a tool and don't seem to, don't seem to actually like it very much. And it's become a kind of part and parcel of the medium, which is curious now because it's so popular. You know, the photography colleges are bursting at the seams. There's more and more documentary photography in the gallery, and I've really been experiencing more and more of that, and it's kind of interesting to think why. It's good. Okay, it's a theory, which might not hold up. what I'm experiencing in the gallery is really two main aesthetic or approaches to photography. On the one hand, a very formalistic approach of collage and abstraction and real kind of fundamental questioning of what photography is through the medium itself. And on the other hand, an increased documentary drive, which might seem oppositional, but actually I think they're doing much the same thing. They're questioning what photography is, how it can be used, and as it goes through yet another identity crisis, it's just a way of questioning that and just a different approach to doing it. Documentary in the 21st century it questions that idea of bearing witness, which is which defined documentary in the 20th century. It was often straightforward and crusading in doing this. But 21st century documentary has to be more, it's much more pervasive, has a much more pervasive uncertainty about facts, and it reveals the transparency of the medium and the subjectivity of the photographer. It's not about giving truthful information, it's questioning what all that might mean. So today's speakers all work very differently within documentary. Their work touches on issues of class, race, voyeurism, and they all take into very careful consideration the role of the photographer and the subjectivity of photography. As I said, they all work very differently, but what they have in common is they seem to like photography, and they really enjoy the complexities of documentary. Rosler says that documentary photography has yet to reach its potential. This was 30 years ago, and I'm curious to see if the photographers here tonight feel that it has, or if their work does this. I'd first like to welcome to the stage Chris.
Well, hello, folks. My name's Chris Vereen. And let's see if we can bring this up here. So welcome to Galesburg, Illinois. 3 generations of my family live in this small town in central western Illinois. My mother and father met there, and I grew up kind of all over the place, but I was born near there, and my roots are all there. And my grandmother taught on the prairie, in the open prairie, in a one-room schoolhouse. Before there really was a Galesburg, Illinois. And when I was about 14, I started making documentary photographs of the town and of my immediate family. I'm an only child, so what you'll see when we go through here, a lot of my cousins and different friends and relations from the town. So my latest book goes through about 26 years of photographs from this area. And you're looking here at East Galesburg. Now, this is back in the 80s. This is one of the first pictures, I think, where I was getting really serious. Because when it started out and I was in high school, no one was guiding me in making the work. And I think by the time I hit about 18 or so, I had met other photographers, and I had read and looked at a lot of things. And I had decided that my family was the core subject, and I was mostly photographing them. And so I went off on a tangent and photographed other families, but I went back to just them. And it's really interesting to hear what Susan's saying about documentary, because I remember I started to write on the pictures because I felt like people were missing my point too much, or that I wanted to have kind of a contract between me and the viewer. And so I thought, well, if I write right on here and it's me writing it, it's like putting your signature on the picture, and I'm telling you the truth. And I used to write on this one right here. Here it says my aunt and my grandpa and my grandmother. It tells you all about them. But I used to write on here that these pictures are nonfiction, because I thought, well, this is going to be the first one you see, and it's still the first one. Here it's something like 15 years later since I started thinking about those issues. But I had to say, These pictures are nonfiction because people always thought that it was some kind of theatrical thing. And very early on, like I say, in my teens, I'm using lights and setting things up, and so it's a question of just how true it is. But I was just trying to exactly copy what our life looked like. This is the Christmas breakfast, and that's my place there on the end. I've moved my chair out of the way. Now, I don't move chairs out of the way anymore. I kind of have arrived at a series of rules. And then this is about 10 years later, the same room. So here we are in the late 80s, and then about 10 years later, they had to move the bed into the dining room when they couldn't climb the stairs anymore. Now, my Aunt Doris and my grandmother are kind of the core of the work. I think my grandmother was one of the people that inspired me to look at the world through kind of an oral history. And she knew, everything she knew about society was kind of how she saw it going through Galesburg. And it's a town of about 30,000 people. It's in the central part of the country, and it's not surrounded by too much. I remember I have 10 minutes. Maybe I should start the timer. So Doris and Eleanor in the garden are really a core part of the work. And following them as they lived and died has been part of a supreme sort of guide to the work. Here's Eleanor at the salon. This is when you go to hair salons, you go to someone's house mostly. There are salons, but the home salon is what's most popular. And here's Mabe and Marion, who were like aunts to me, and this is Mabe and Marion, and then their front porch next to them. Now here's my cousins Candy and Heidi on the left in the 80s, and then on the right, that's Heidi in 2006. So where the work's going a lot now is to look at over time. This picture didn't really, I took it back in the 80s, but it didn't really make sense until I had another picture to go with it. And I think early on, I'm making the work without as much of a principled way of doing it, and I'm a teenager and not really studied, and now am much more so. And here's Candy again. Now, this is her wedding. Candy's wedding with her two favorite customers from her job at the Sirloin Stockade. Now, the Sirloin Stockade, is one of those really big all-you-can-eat restaurants that's maybe the fanciest place in town, and Candy worked there. These two gentlemen would come in every day for the early bird senior special dinner, like at 4 o'clock, and had been at the wedding, and they really do wear formal sort of Western wear all the time. People think, I don't know how many people think this, but I certainly get a share of people thinking that, well, are you asking him to wear this? Are you telling him to do this? Do you tell him where to stand? And certainly in pictures like this, it's a formal occasion, so people are kind of setting up their own picture. But I very much have a hands-off approach to making anything happen. I'm just waiting and taking thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures and then editing. Candy and Craig lost their jobs when the factories moved to Mexico. Candy, Katie, and Cody. So a lot of what's happening with the work just depends on what happens to Galesburg. And Galesburg's running into terrible times. Their recession hit years before the big national recession. And the factory where Candy and Craig worked that made refrigerators closed and moved to Mexico, so there's no jobs left in town. The factory was one of our biggest employers. And also Gates Rubber closed. The railroad tie factory is closed. So there's very little labor to do there. And this has been a big running story. And we're still in Candy's chapter here. The same day they signed the divorce papers, a tornado hit the house. Candy and Craig's divorce is now the cover of the new book. Their wedding was the cover of the old book 10 years ago. And then Candy insisted, she wanted me to name the book Candy's Divorce. She takes a lot of, I think, pleasure in being in the artwork, sad or happy. Most of my family who are in it because they keep coming to me and participating. I'm definitely not dragging them out in front of the camera. So Candy's house. The house had become Candy's that day. And this is Craig's new house, her ex-husband, and Candy's new boyfriend. My cousin Steve is another divorce story, and we won't go through the whole story, but so that you see how I make the work. My cousin Steve with his daughter, his wife had just left them. And this story follows Steve through his life. There's Steve with my Aunt Doris at the McDonald's Christmas. And then many years later, you see the change between people. Wrapping presents for Candy's kids, and there's Doris in the back. Doris stays nights with a shut-in. My cousin Libby's a traditional pig farmer with a small farm outside of town. Libby's pig farm here with the cats. And when that day, there were 3 sows pigging all at the same time, so it was easy to get a lot of pictures. Canning vegetables. When the farm foreclosed, Libby and Bill moved in with Great Uncle Richard. Another big aspect to my work is my parents both worked at the research hospital, which is a huge mental hospital in town that's long since closed. And a lot of the people who had lived in the hospital were so heavily in the institutional culture that they never really were able to come out. So even when the hospital closed, a lot of people stayed in a smaller space where some of my family also were housed. And my parents had worked there, and people like Dawn got out of the system and live in the town. And people like Dorothy here really stayed institutionalized for life. But the camera and pictures has been an extremely uplifting and positive part of this work. And so you see here's more about Dorothy and my mom visiting Dorothy. Once people are in my work, it's for life. It's my whole life's work. So this is an ongoing project that just has no end. And the people can count on me to come and bring pictures and share pictures and be with them. Here's Rosie and her mom, both who had lived in the research hospital, at Rosie's apartment on her mother's birthday. Rosie and her new cart, May Rose. Rosie and her bike, Betsy, do volunteer work together on Main Street. Now, the New York Times got involved and did a Sunday magazine story where they ran my photograph and did an interview with Rosie, and she talked a lot about trying to get respect in a town that thinks you're a crazy lunatic and when really you just want to help people. And she really does a lot of volunteer work. There's more than I can cram into 10 minutes, but just to introduce you to this story, here's Gary, also associated with the hospital. My Aunt Doris was his babysitter in his yard. And public television came and interviewed Gary after the work became popular. Rosie's new apartment and Rosie calling to the animals at her mother's grave. Max's story is a long one. I work in chapters, so if you get the chance to look at a lot of my work, it goes through people's lives. Max is a Holocaust survivor, and you learn a lot about him. He was my grandfather's dear friend. My grandfather worked for the railroad, and they had a scrap metal business through the railroad, and Max and my grandpa used to climb through the yards. Here's the landscape, and more with the landscape. That's Travis's house. Travis and his extended family are now married into my family. My cousin married extended cousins of Travis. And Travis had been in the work since a very young age, but then around this age, around 17, 18, that's Travis at 17, and then Travis at about 6. So we then become connected by this distant marriage, but we were already good friends. Wrestling Dalton, there's Travis again, and Travis's neighbors. More with Travis's extended family over the years, Travis's Aunt Pam and Travis's grandma. Travis's mom got married. My cousin's husband's brother's cousin's cousins, which is exactly the connection. Rebecca, Destiny, and Autumn. And so in the new book, you see a lot of Rebecca, Destiny, and Autumn growing up. And Dan and Pam adopt them. Their mother kind of runs off, and they adopt them and are raising them. Dan and Pam's trailer. Dan's kids live here half the time. Yes, about 10 minutes, right? And you can watch them grow up. There's their bedroom. Destiny's birthday. The first day of school. And Cheyenne and Dalton's life goes by. Sonia, their next door neighbor. And Amber's chapter, Crystal and Amber's story is a long one. I won't tell you, but just bring you into it a little bit. Watch them grow up. And their friends grow up. The pregnancy test. The first baby. The second baby, Lexus. Amber and the girls are living in the car, and the state took custody of the girls. Amber got her girls back, and now they live in the abandoned restaurant. Thanks a lot.
So my name is Michael Wolf. I'm going to try to guide you through 7 years of work in 10 minutes, which is not easy. Before I destroy this apple A, there we go. And then we make a slideshow. I worked as a photojournalist from 1976 until 2003, and my professional life is basically divided into my time as an editorial photographer and the time after. The work I'm showing you now all evolved and was photographed starting around 2003, when I decided not to work as an editorial photographer any longer and to work, as they call it, on my own projects. One of the first was called Sitting in China, or The Bastard Chairs. It was, these were all taken during my trips through the mainland, and in the end they're a metaphor for Chinese society where people are very thrifty, you still have time to sit outside. And it's also a form of design without designers. I moved to Asia in 1994, and all the work you see here is taken there, except for 2 projects, and I'll explain why later. In 2003, you had SARS in Hong Kong, and a lot of people left, including my wife and my son, and I decided to stay there because I thought it would have been a crime for me to live so long in Hong Kong and not to work on a photographic project about the city. So here again, I've started with a vernacular, what I called Hong Kong Backdoor, and put together a whole series of these images. And then I thought I wanted to combine them with something, and came up with the idea of combining them with the architecture, which is one of the densest in the world. And that's how this series came about, the architecture of density. I exhibited these topics quite a bit, and I was always asked the question, how do people live in there? How do they live in these high-rises? What does it look like? And in 2006, I did a project called 100 by 100, where I found an estate where every flat had the same measurements, 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. So I went through the estate, found 100 residents who were willing to be photographed, and did the project 100 by 100. Again, the people were not so interesting for me. For me, it was more, how do people use this space, this little amount of space, and how do people use it differently from each other? You again have this form of Hong Kong laissez-faire design where you just stick stuff into plastic bags, hang it however you can, but it's I love that form of practicalness. In between, I did a story called The Real Toy Story, and this is an illustration why I left photojournalism, because I felt limited by it. I was always asked to take 6 double pages for a magazine, always doing pictures on a page. And I had a lot of other ideas. For the real Toy Story, I rented a truck and drove from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and I stopped at every secondhand store along the way and collected every toy I could find made in China. I brought them back to Hong Kong, and I sanded off the backs of all of them, and I made an installation into which I inserted portraits of workers in toy factories in China. But this is what this is the first time it was exhibited in Hong Kong. Here you can see the embedded portraits. I took this installation to Chicago, to the Museum of Contemporary Photography, and as I was coming into the city, I was fascinated by these high-rises, which were very different in Hong Kong, because in Hong Kong, it's more or less about the surface of the buildings, but in Chicago, you could look into them. And I felt I was like in a film about Edward Hopper, and I remember coming into the museum, and I met Natasha Egan, and I think the third sentence out of my mouth was, "Can't you find an artist in residency for me?" And that's how this topic came about. And Aperture did the book then with me in 2008, called The Transparent City. These two topics which I'm showing now are the last ones I've done over the past 18 months or so, and they're both on show at the Bruce Silverstein Gallery if you want to have a look. Tokyo Compression, actually, the idea or the seed for it, I had in 1996 when the sarin gas attacks happened in Tokyo, and I went there as a photojournalist and spent a lot of time in the subways, but I went to one subway station on the Odakyu line where you only had one train track coming in, and the people would get in on this side, and I could stand on the platform on this side and basically get 2 inches away from the glass. And there was no other platform in Tokyo where this was possible. And I remember that I put the files away. Those were slides at the time. I put them away, and then 2 years ago I thought, this would be another facet of my Life in Cities. This is an ongoing project of my Life in Cities project. And I went back, I looked for it. Fortunately, that station was still there. And I spent 30 days there, six sections, always Monday to Friday, always from 7:30 in the morning until 8:45. Every 80 seconds a train would come in, rush hour in the morning. And I would be standing on the other side of the glass, a voyeur, of course, photographing the people there. So it's very ambivalent, of course, my role as a photographer, because, of course, these people cannot defend themselves. They can't say no. They're behind the glass. The door doesn't open. They can only put their hands in front of their face. They could try to hide behind a column. But it was part of the topic. And I remember in the middle of this, when I was maybe 2/3 finished, I went to a Japanese publisher because I thought it would be interesting to co-publish it with a Japanese publisher. And he went and he looked through about 80 pictures, and then he looked up and said, "So what? I do this every day for 40 years." So it goes to show you how important the context is, of course. See, when she saw me, she immediately hid behind the post, but then she was just going to sneak a little look. And that's when I pressed the shutter. This is an entirely different project, actually not involving human beings directly at all. In 2008, my wife received a job offer to move to Paris, or which would have entailed her to move to Paris. And because she'd come with me to Asia, I said, okay, if you really want to go there, there's nothing stopping you. So she moved there, and I went with her initially and did not like it. I'm really not a friend of Paris. It hasn't changed in 100 years. I find it visually very unexciting. So I holed up in my room, and I decided to explore the city via Google Street View. So this is a project which I basically did because I wanted to get to know the city in some way. On another level, Paris had been photographed so often and there were so many cliches that I just had no idea how to get around it. And so I started exploring using Google Street View and its interface. I was using another platform and basically mining it for my own images. And of course, the crop here is always essential. So I would systematically go down every street from the beginning to the end, go up to the next block, head back down, look into cars, look into doorways. Some of these are also from Manhattan, by the way. They're not all from Paris, but a majority of them are. And there are lots of tangents. One aspect I was looking for, of course, because Google always insists that the faces are all blurred. Obviously, they're not. So I did a whole series of portraits where you can clearly see the people. Or I love these narratives going on, these little stories that I imagined. You don't know if these people are even aware of each other, but I saw something in this which, it's a little bit like Antonioni's Blow Up, for instance. Or here the man in the background coming out, what is he going to do? Reflections, I'd look for reflections in mirrors and in windows. And this project was shown this is also, I figured out quite quickly, though, that Google has its copyright mark. Every 10 inches or so, there's a big Google copyright 2009 or 2008. So, of course, I would intentionally go and photograph that. I found it rather bizarre to copyright the sky like that. And in the fall of this year, Foam from Amsterdam contacted me and asked if I was interested in doing a site-specific installation with this Street View work. So what we did is we enlarged it to 11 by 13 feet and put it onto billboards and placed it around the business district of Amsterdam. And this is what it looked like. That's it. Thank you.
Good evening. I actually exchanged a few words through email with Martha Rosler today, and she wanted me to tell you guys that she believes that documentary is all the more necessary today, but it still needs work. And she put an exclamation mark after that. So that is my word from Martha Rosler. I'm not going to read this whole quote because it's pretty long, but it is the last paragraph of, the seminal essay that we're talking in context with today. And, I reread the whole thing at 6 a.m. this morning, and I got to the end, and I was like, aha, there's the payoff for it. So I've been struggling with this paragraph, and it's really where my work has been coming from all along, but of course I'm the one who wasn't born until after this essay was published. So what I'm going to do is kind of weave in and out of a narrative that talks about my interest in documentary work, but also personally, like Chris, the location of where I'm from is very important to me. The collaboration between my family and my mother blurs the line between self-portraiture and social documentary. I use photography to employ themes regarding the body and landscape, familial and communal history, private and public space, and human complexity. My work has a deep concern for the mother-daughter relationship, relentlessly documenting encounters with Grandma Ruby, born 1925 through 2009, Mom, born at 1959, and myself, born 1982, enables me to break unspoken intergenerational cycles. We are wrestling with internalized life experiences, perceptions of ourselves, and familial personas developed by social political baggage. All of my photographs are created in Braddock, Pennsylvania, a historical steel mill town from America's industrial period. It is home of Andrew Carnegie's steel mill, the Edgar Thomson Works, which is still functioning today. Grandma Ruby, Mom, and myself grew up in significantly different social and economic climates in Braddock. Grandma Ruby witnessed Braddock's prosperous days of department stores, theaters, restaurants. Mom witnessed the steel mills close and white flight to suburban developments. I witnessed the crack epidemic and the demise of my family and my community. Between our three generations, we not only witnessed, we experienced and internalized the end of industrialization and rise of deindustrialization. Looking both inwardly and outwardly, I desire to move beyond boundaries. Similar to Annie, Lucy, and Zuela, heroines from a Jamaica Kincaid novel, I am in search of a new space, place, and time. There is a tight pressure and sharp, piercing pain in my chest. The lack of deep sleep has not worn off. I feel a sense of imbalance. The haze that forms the sky are from millions of tiny particles that pass through my lungs and into my bloodstream. Like carbon monoxide, they are odorless and have the potential to kill. The United States steel industry marks one of America's prominent historical times. Many families immigrated and migrated here for the American dream. For many years, we have lived under the dirt and noise from the mills, working for one man's profit, one man and his business partners' profit. The main street was Braddock Avenue. Grandma Ruby always described it. There used to be 3 theaters, the Capitol, Paramount, and the Times. There were restaurants, 5 and 10 stores, children's stores, and furniture stores. We used to have everything. By the 1980s, when my generation walked the streets, most of the steel mills were closed, and there was nothing left except 12 bars, 3 jitney stations, Bell's Meat Market, Stamboli's Fish Market, the Pawn Shop, and Braddock News, and 1 restaurant, which was the cafeteria in our hospital. Most of the children I went to school with came from broken homes, living with their mom, close relatives, or their grandparents. When I was 10 years old, Grandma Ruby would send me into every bar on Braddock Avenue looking for Mom. She would be missing for weeks. Mom was playing her 45 records. She put on her favorite song, Girls' Night Out by Taylor Collins, because it was our night to go drinking. It's irritating when you put that camera in my face. Why do you like taking pictures of me? Because it's my way of accepting you as you are and gaining back all the time we lost. The shutter clicked. Then we switched places. I asked her, what do you see when you look at me? She looked through the viewfinder and said, I see a lot of me in you. It's like you're lost, like you don't have nobody. You got your mother, but right now you don't understand. She paused and made a photograph of me. Grandma Ruby's husband died on Mom's first birthday. Left to raise 6 children during the 60s could not have been an easy task. She worked for goodwill. Grandma Ruby internalized the idea that black women aren't supposed to cry. They're to remain silent and endure suffering. Like the women in Julia Margaret Cameron's portraits, she is the divine mother figure. It felt like a knife stabbing me in my kidneys, like a screwdriver twisting in my spine. I couldn't keep it down. Dehydrated, I slumped over the cold linoleum floor. My muscles tightened, the last bit of water squeezed from the tissues in my stomach. Mom loves her cat Ziggy more than me. If the woman in Vermeer's painting, Lady with a Jug, is the guardian of the domestic and has the power to resist and transmute the murderous onslaughts of history, then Mom has a lot she has to juggle. She's a prisoner in her own home. We fall below the county, country, and the world in cardiovascular disease, infant mortality, and asthma. Gramps always wore a suit and bow tie with a fedora, suspenders, and alligator shoes. Every time he saw me, he would say, "Hello, doll," and give me a napkin filled with candy. The sugar-coated orange slices and Snickers were my favorite. He would pound the cane on the floor and scream Grandma Ruby's name throughout the night. If we weren't tending to Gramps, we sat in separate rooms. Gramps was one of the few black men to work in the steel mills. Once he retired, he collected his pension. He always voted Republican. In our state, laws do not work for grandparents raising grandchildren. Parental rights to enroll her child in school, denied. Guardianship subsidies, denied. Medical care, denied. Custody, denied. She would shout her nicknames while she was in bed. Midgie, Pee-wee, Cookie, Toy. Sometimes she would call on the Lord. The doctor told us that if he operated on her, there would only be a 15% chance it would go away. Grandma Ruby waited a few days. I supported her decision. Between my background and my foreground, I'm not sure where I stand. It was Sunday, January 18th. Disoriented, I stumbled to the bathroom floor. I started taking deep breaths, hyperventilating, gasping for air. Mom was calling. She told me she was complaining about chest pains, that she couldn't breathe. She lives 2 blocks away from the hospital. It took them 3 hours to get there. 9:15 p.m., third quarter, Steelers-Ravens game. Mom called again. She said she could not breathe. There was too much fluid in her lungs. Her heart overworked from pumping for oxygen. There was too much fluid. She could see cramps. Her organs failed. They covered her body with a white sheet and left her there. Stop there.
I'll kind of start backwards. First, LaToya's presentation, she really adds so much to that performance, and it's something that I'm always curious about when you have documentary photographer. What happens when you take the photographer away? Does it hold up? Does it have as much presence? And I think that LaToya's presentation today really brings that to the fore, that are the photographs enough, or do we need her there with us to appreciate those properly? Ideas of voyeurism with Michael's work really obviously there, and really interesting, but I love the work done in Paris, and the fact that you concentrated on mirrors and reflections and windows made me think of Auger and how you're kind of following a tradition and totally kind of subverting it and twisting it, and it's funny as well, which is welcome in documentary photography. And also ideas of voyeurism in Chris's work, but in a very different way, of what happens when you put that work out there that's very intimate. And some people laugh, and how does that feel? I was curious really to ask you about that. So perhaps if we start there, and then we'll move on.
Well, I think it's an interesting question you're asking, because in making this work, the bulk of it, even to this day, was kind of made without knowing I would have a big audience. So much of it was made without my full understanding of where it would go, and I didn't make it for an audience as much as I made it for my family, and sort of made it for me and the few people that I knew, even through graduate school. The idea of it being shown sort of outside of the confines of a couple places in Atlanta, Georgia, or in Galesburg where we show, I didn't really think about it, And then when the first book came out in 2000, all of a sudden it was worldwide, and I was afraid in some way that that people would misunderstand the work, or that the family and the people would dislike the idea that now it had become famous, And I was pretty worried about it, but there was nothing I could do. I had made the work without a plan, and then it got a plan because it became exhibited all over, and now it's 10 years later, and nothing has really changed. In some ways, maybe the work has done a few good things in Galesburg, but mostly it's things are the same, And you're asking about, well, what if? I think people need to laugh, and I think that I'm looking for a joy or a laughter sometimes within the sadness, and I think a lot of the people who are in my work, even in sad stories, put forth a kind of resilient personality that people can hang on to, whether they're laughing or embracing those people. I think I'm looking for people to respond in any type of real way, and I think if you spend some time with the work, you don't miss its mark. That's been my experience over the decade of the work becoming well known and being wider and wider in publishing.
Okay, LaToya, same question to you. I get the feeling that you really want people to read your work in a certain way. How is that possible once the work is out there?
Well, It's been out there for about one year consecutively, and I've noticed that that's been something that I've had to struggle with. Typically, the titles are very formal, direct, and to the point, like Grandma Ruby and JC in her kitchen. I also started to hint at my mother's participation and how she's the one making the images of me by titling them Mommy, spelled M-O-M-M-E, to suggest that participation. So for the most part, I give the audience a chance to enter my work in many different ways. So you can see it at a gallery on the wall with the title, and it stays open-ended, or you can view it within the context of other video installations that are next to them that usually mimic, like you saw in the first video. They bring the images to life. Or I can show up live, like I am here, and do a performance narrative piece with it. So I'm kind of controlling the way that people can enter the work, and I haven't made a solid commitment. I guess it just depends on the format.
Okay. Now, Michael, your work operates very differently, and it's about ambiguity and the different ways that it can be read in different contexts. It's much more slippery than these two.
Well, some of it is, some of it isn't. For me, one of the reasons, and I mentioned it during my talk, one of the reasons I left editorial photography or magazine photography because I felt so limited by pictures on a page. And the installation, The Toy Story, was for me a direct reaction, for instance, to an assignment I had that I did for Stern Magazine, China Factory of the World. And it turned out to be 7 double pages, and I said, so what? But what would happen if I collected 10,000 or 15 or 20,000 toys and embedded photographs in them? So this alternate way of presenting something became very crucial for me. And it's the same with 100 by 100. There are 100 rooms, and it's interesting to look at them. I did a book, but what I found much more interesting is to construct a room which is exactly the same size as the room I photographed, 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet, and mounting all the photographs inside that room. And then when you enter it, it's the only time when you really have a physical feeling of how small that space actually is. Because if you look at a room photographed with a wide angle, it invariably looks much larger than it is. So in that sense, you had a sudden visceral experience of being inside a room, which is really, you can't imagine how small 100 square feet are. So for me, I felt really, it was a whole new way of presenting things which opened to me regardless of if it's voyeurism or not. It was just very free suddenly that I could experiment with all these different ways of presentation or talking or presenting it on a wall. There's so many ways of doing it. It's a matter of being effective.
Exactly. And
the same thing, of course, with Street View. The idea to show these in this huge scale of 11 by 13 feet in size on the street, again, had this very interesting disconnect, because the original images are maybe only 2 square inches in size, and here they're suddenly enormous. So it again had this interesting effect of, perhaps making people look more.
I think the methods of display and communication dissemination are really crucial, because the rectangles on walls don't really work anymore for an audience, or rectangles on paper don't really work anymore. Chris, how have you displayed your work?
Well, it's rectangles on the wall. But the handwriting is a whole different level for me. And you're talking about that it has to be something more. I didn't do it because I thought theoretically it needed to be more, but I did it because I thought that there was so much photography, and now is even more, that looks very real, but is instead something that's been staged. So it has this caught moment or decisive moment look to it. But it is instead something that's very carefully arranged. And what I'm doing is the reverse, is getting something that's real and then photographing it I'm editing it so that it has a universal meaning, that I'm looking for the great picture that can speak to many different people in different ways. And I felt that the handwriting is and I struggle with the handwriting because I don't like it, but I'm stuck with it. I think I always am working on it, and it's coming, and the few things I say make it more personal, and I think a more whole truth, because it's my family and my people and always will be. And so when I'm there, it's like me there with you, the audience. I'm there too with you. It's not just here for you to see. It's me and you together. My understanding of it usually tells you why I took the picture, or why we decided a picture. They got married, or that the same day they signed the divorce papers is something that's running through our heads, maybe. Or so I think. I think the handwriting for me is very necessary, but I struggle with it because it's unbeautiful and it corrupts the space, and I don't like my handwriting, but it's all I have, and it's the truth that I've got, so I use it.
Any thoughts on that? This because again, this idea of truth and authenticity kind of reverberates always with documentary photography. I wondered if either of you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I spent a good amount of time with Chris's work in grad school. You were certainly someone who inspired me when I was working on my thesis myself. And writing is a really tricky tool and thing to use, because once it's written, it's like this contract. Everyone's going to hold you to what was written, and often it can compromise the image. So, I mean, I understand your frustration is what I can say about that, but that's why I only verbally speak, and I don't allow anyone to ever see the text beyond, 300-word artist statement, because it's difficult. But, I mean, it certainly has its place, and we get another layer and sensibility of your relationship to them because of what you're offering us. And so in that regard, I think that is important.
And Michael, do you use text at all?
Well, sometimes I try to write a short preface to the book, but I haven't worked on a project where I've directly correlated diary entries or my thoughts to specific pictures. But I wanted to get back to this idea of truth in documentary photography. There's one image which I showed from Chicago. It's of a condominium where a couple is watching Hitchcock's Rear Window. And I've often been asked, is that real? And I've given 3 answers. The one answer is that I hung out at the bottom of the condominium where the guard is and waited until that couple came, and I gave them a DVD of the Rear Window and asked them to put it into their DVD player the next evening at 8 p.m. and stop the frame and dim the TV screen a bit so it would match the outside light, and I would take my picture. The second, and I've given all these answers on various occasions. The second one was that I was in Chicago, I looked at the TV guide, and I saw the Rear Window was playing at 8 p.m. I organized to get up on the roof, and I took the picture at exactly that moment. And the third answer is that I photoshopped it. So does it matter? That's a question. I say it doesn't. So nowadays...
Quick show of hands. I say it doesn't matter either. Who thinks it does? Okay, split about halfway, and one sitting on the fence.
Well, it depends. If they were in a court and had insisted that they were watching that movie and weren't, then it could matter. It could be a matter of life and death, but not in the context of what I was doing there.
We're really short on time, so there's a whole stack of stuff that we could talk about here. It's all very complex stuff, but I'm going to open it out to the audience and see if there's any questions. There is a microphone coming around. Yes? So please...
How short on time are we? How short on time are we?
We've got 10 minutes left.
Oh, that's very short.
So... any thoughts, comments, questions? Lady right in the middle.
I think Susan started to ask this, and then maybe I missed the answer, but Chris, I was curious if when you have exhibited your work, you did include your handwriting the same way that it was in the book.
Yeah, that's what it looks like, and the book is another format. I forgot to say it's rectangles on the walls, but I think my primo method is that you can hold it in your hands. So that's.
And all of you, Latoya, I know you want to do a book, so all of you use the book format.
Right.
Michael, why?
Well, it's a great way to get work out there and to be seen, and of course you have many more pages if need be than you do in a magazine. And it's a wonderful, I mean, at the moment we're experiencing a renaissance in photo book publishing, and there's so many interesting people doing things in new forms, and you'd think it's just a book, but there are lots of ways to experiment and to improve on it and to get your idea across. So I think it's a marvelous medium which goes way beyond or gives you another facet or another possibility of showing something besides doing an exhibition, for instance. And you can take it home, you can look at it. It's a great medium.
Absolutely. I'm really enjoying that renaissance in photography books, but my bank balance certainly isn't. Any other thoughts, questions, or comments?
Let me say thank you all for your wonderful work. I'm curious because all three of you are working very much in a documentary style, but the way you're approaching it is so different. Chris and Latoya, your work is so personal, autobiographical, and Michael, your work is so, well, anonymous. So I'm curious to hear from you. Can you imagine switching roles for a moment? What would your work look like if you went out and took pictures that were anonymous, where you didn't know the people? How would that feel? Would you even want to try it? What would it look like? Michael, what would it look for you if you photographed your family?
Well, I can answer quick. I photograph my family all the time. It's just that I don't feel the need to make a public project out of it. But it's not something which I'm against or which I feel it's not something I want to do. These other projects have just been important for me at this time, and it could be the death of my father, or it's a myriad of personal things which suddenly could swim up to the top and make it important for me to do a project about.
Latoya.
For me, it's very necessary that I continue to work in the mode that I'm working in because of the politics and the social politics and the cultural criticism that needs to come up now. I wasn't very aware that this is where my work was headed until I was smacked with these Levi campaigns in New York. You know, how odd is that to see that next to my images, and I've been making work with my family there for 10 years. So, you know, society is shaping my work in the direction, and I'm just going to let that continue to guide me, and I don't think I need to do anything outside of that, not now.
I'll add something quickly to that. I think it's an interesting question. Because I confine, my rules are the city limits of Galesburg, and that's where the work has to be, basically. But there's a yearning in me to also photograph somehow beyond that, and so I put together other projects where I can photograph people that I don't know. But it's usually, in fact, it's such a different thing that I work in a totally different persona. And so Chris Vereen changes his name, and it brings out my self-identified queer side, and I'm in drag, and I'm working in a fully different world because this is my grandmother's world. And so when I'm going to go and work in some other way that's more voyeuristic, and that brings out my performance artwork and brings out using the camera with people I don't know, I have to do it in a whole different identity for me. So I think there's a yearning, maybe in a lot of artists, to do that, and so it satisfies that thing. But I have to make it this separate thing. There's a whole other name. There's a whole other world, which we couldn't quite touch on in 10 minutes today. But I'd be glad to talk about it with anybody. If you want to learn about Cherry Nevers, she's excited to talk. So.
Okay, any more questions?
I just have a question for Chris really quickly. Your work appears to be lit. And I wanted to know
Flash and sunlight.
that was my question. How do you rectify that with documentary?
Well, it's too dark to take the picture.
But it doesn't affect it being more or less candid or anything like that for you.
You know, I think if you're going to knock out, 16 rolls of film in a couple of hours, the flash stops being such a problem. But then I also have to edit away a lot of the things where flash was a problem, or bothering people, or it ruined the mood or something. And there's a lot of the work actually without flash these days. But the first 15 years or so, and even the early work, I'm setting up lights in the mid 80s. So that's an interesting question, though. Is it documentary if there's flash? I have to ask my students who are here.
I want to hear Sherry talk about Galesburg. This is to Chris.
Oh, yeah. Well, not tonight, probably.
Oh.
Susan talked at the beginning about the possibilities of documentary photography and above all contemporary documentary photography. And I'm just wondering what you think about it. What are the possibilities in comparison to traditional photography?
That's to everyone?
Yeah, for all of them.
That's to you.
Well, people don't want to hear me. I want to hear you guys. So the question is really...
where the possibilities are in contemporary documentary photography, because you talked at the beginning all about that there are loads of photographers who are perceiving documentary photography as something like not negative, but seeing all the problems within contemporary documentary photography. And I'm wondering, because you're working within contemporary context, where you're going to see the possibilities and where the advantage of our situation of the crisis or whatever.
I think these three people that we have here are great examples of the possibilities of documentary, of how it can be presented, exactly what it means by looking at Google. That, to me, is absolutely what documentary photography should be doing, and how wide and how varied it can be. I'm also really intrigued by photojournalism and where that's going and what's happening there. I think it is actually it can be or could be a tremendously exciting field, instead of a kind of dead end, which I hear all the time. I also hear that there's a crisis all the time. Photography's been in crisis since the beginning, and that's kind of what drives it and makes it exciting. So I think actually now we're experiencing so many different types of documentaries. It's a really, really exciting time, and not a negative one at all. And I think that these three approaches, just these three people and these different approaches, shows that possibility and that excitement. Any other thoughts?
Well, I think if one talks about a crisis in photojournalism, it's very real, just because the magazines are closing down and there are a lot fewer outlets for someone who studies photojournalism to earn a decent living with it. But regarding photography in general, I think it's just the possibilities are exploding. If we just look at how many images are going to be around based on the terabytes of hard drives which are filled every day, I think it's going to be a whole new area just curating this found material. I remember in the 50s there was or 10 years ago, I'd go to flea markets and I'd be excited if I found a carousel of 36 Kodachrome slides, and I'd look at it, and there was a guy in LA going around, I think he just collected slides of traveling salesmen which they used for their presentations, and he did an hour-and-a-half show and filled movie theaters with it. But can you imagine now if you go to one of these computer junk places and you find 1,000 hard drives, you could probably spend 50 years going through it just mining these images, and it's going to be a fascinating possibility to do it. I mean, I just see it with Google Street View. I could spend the next 5 years, if I don't go blind before, just going to different places and looking and refining my concept and things like that. So there's a lot out there to do.
I think that something that strings these photographers, artists together is this idea of commitment. Chris, this has been a lifetime commitment for you, and much the same with LaToya. And the commitment to look through all those images, I was like, at what point did you just want to burn your hair? It's a real kind of characteristic of documentary photography, and one which kind of absolutely is the heart of it. We've got time for one more question. You very patiently had your hand up at the front here.
Yeah, it seems to me like there's a lot of talk about differences, and for me it seems all this work does seem very similar in nature, and that it's all very premeditated, and it's all very thought and constructed, and theorized before it's made or as it's made, and in somewhat even with his I can't remember names, with his work, or the Google Street View work, it seemed very theoretical, not documentary in nature. It seemed very much about documenting photography, not necessarily documentary photography. And it just, to me, it seems like that what's at question is sort of an existential question, which is identity, which seems to be the struggle with all three, I think, that they seem to be exploring, is that nature of identity, both in an alienating world, much like Bertrand Russell's Authority in the Individual. If you haven't read that, you really should. It's all about the city and the alienation, and both through somebody's personal struggle with, whatever, through this Illinois and Philadelphia. But what seems to me is that it contrasts a lot what was mentioned earlier with like Dorothea Lange and the FSA, which a lot of their methods of work, and in Dorothea Lange's words specifically, was that she said that we must never photograph with intentions, that we should operate more open, sensitized, almost like a piece of film. That was sort of her sort of dogma, and it sort of was the running dogma in photography for a long time, and has been in some cases. And I just have to say I'm a big fan of rectangles on walls. I believe John Sarkowski actually defined a photograph as a rectangle on the wall, but when someone asked him what a photograph was. But anyways, thank you very much for sharing your...
Great. That was a very long comment. Thank you. But not one that to be dismissed. And I liked what you said about these photographers using documenting photography and not necessarily documentary photography. I thought that was smart. So thank you. Any thoughts? I think they do, and I think that's kind of very much part of contemporary documentary photography now. It deals not just with what the photograph is taking, but how it's taken and why it's taken. I think that's really, really important to do that.
I was going to say something, because the reason I'm at where I'm at today is because I was obsessed with the FSA and what that means to do that. And when the government gets involved and sends photographers to a location and a space that is not theirs, whether it's the landscape or the people or just still lives, what that means and how that's going to look and be archived. And Dorothea Lange's image, that migrant mother, we'll have that debate and conversation forever, because look at how Florence felt years later after she made that image and it became this iconic image. So the representation that's gone out with her into the world, she had no control over. And because I kept studying that and looking at that, being curious about that, it became important for me to become one of them. Like, what would that be like if I'm from this area that still looks like the Great Depression, and I need that agency and power for myself? I don't need Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange to come in to my area for me to have to talk about these things through the use of the government being able to say, see, it is a better place, when in reality we're still very oppressed. And this socioeconomic struggle is very prevalent and real in the United States today, and we still keep repressing these issues. So it's really important for me to kind of come up against propaganda and who's taking these images and why and when. And I think that it's the people that are within that community in that space should be photographing themselves. Just a political thought.
Michael, any thoughts on the comment about using the actual medium and documenting photography?
Oh yeah, I mean it's been done all through history. Everyone reflects the medium, or it's been reflected a lot, and it was part of the process which I was doing. And quite honestly, in the beginning I wasn't even sure if I would ever work through this and ever make a project out of it. It was basically boredom with Paris, being fed up, and filling my time with photographing directly from the screen. And it was and then of course I was having fun discovering something. Oh, that looks like a Cartier-Bresson. Oh, that looks like a Doisneau. So I was intentionally quoting different photographic styles. But it took me 6 months, actually, before I made the first print. And I made a print 48 by 64 inches, and that's what convinced me to go through with it, because the prints are extremely beautiful. They have this wonderful RGB pattern from the screen going through it. So this whole element of is the picture visceral, is it sensual, is crucial for me. So, of course, it goes beyond the pure thought. Do I like to see that picture on the wall? And when I saw it, I did like it, and I went ahead with it. So there are two elements in there for me, of course. The conceptual, which is important, but also how does it look?
Any closing thoughts, Chris?
I don't think we can close these thoughts, but it's very interesting. Now everybody can do photography because the cameras got easier and they're prevalent and it's everywhere, and so maybe now is the time that lots of people are making documentary work, whether they know it or not. But I don't know. I can't close the thoughts, but it's interesting what you say about that people should be take ownership of their life and photograph it, and I think that maybe that's going to blow up. I don't know. Maybe that will happen more and more and more and more. YouTube and all these things are just piling up as we're sitting here, and who will watch it all? But when we do, there's so much to learn from it. So it's just fascinating.
Thanks. Sorry, we do have to close up. Yes, we're living in, as I sort of started off saying, we're living in such a different time from when this essay was written, and people now have a different way of looking and thinking about photography. My students can look at thousands of images a day, and that's completely normal. I can't look at more than 3 without having to kind of, clear my head and look at the next one, which reveals that I'm quite old, but also it's just a really very, very different way of experiencing documentary photography. And again, just to thank our panelists and to say that those very traditional modes of photography, be that the FSA or Cartier-Bresson or the other photographers which they've mentioned, are still the ballast for their work, even though it may look very different and do very different things. So that rich history is something which is still so embedded within contemporary photography, and as I said, something that these photographers actually seem to like and admire and work with. So thank you.